مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. للمرة الثالثة خلال عام ضرب الإرهاب فرنسا. أولا وقع هجوم على مقر مجلة إخبارية، ثم وقع هجوم على قطار آلي السرعة، وبعدها وقبل بضعة أيام وقعت هجمات منظمة على صالات للحفلات الموسيقية واستاد رياضي ومطاعم. أقدم خلفاء أمريكا، الدولة التي حبت لمساعدتنا في حربنا من أجل الاستقلال قبل أكثر من 200 عام، هي اليوم تحت الحصار. فار مشاهدة الأمريكيين للصور وسماعهم للروايات حول ما حدث في باريس خلف هذا أثرا على شؤوننا السياسية، بداية من الرئيس أوباما مرورا بالكونغرس ووصولا إلى مرشحين للرئاسة. أصبح محور تركيز المناظرات الرئاسية ماذا ينبغي أن تفعل أمريكا حيال تهديد الإرهاب الجهادي. وفي الأيام التي تلت ذلك امتلأت الصحف والبرامج التلفزيونية الأمريكية بكل أنواع الأفكار، بعضها مشروع وبعضها قبيح، لمناقشة الاستجابة السياسية لهجمات باريس وتأثيرها على انتخاباتنا الرئاسية. يسرني أن أرحب بلجنتنا التي تضم الخبيرين السياسيين نورمان أورنستين وستيف كليمنز. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. I'm sitting here with our panel of political experts to talk about the political fallout of the terrible attacks in Paris for American elections and the American political debate. Gentlemen, thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
Horrendous events in Paris. The reverberations are felt here in America as well. Let's talk a bit about the direct impact on some of our political debates, including that of our primary election campaigns among both Democrats and Republicans. Let's first focus on the Republicans. How has Paris affected the primary debate? What issues have risen to the fore, and who has benefited and who suffers as a result of a renewed focus on terrorism as opposed to the other issues on the presidential agenda? Norm, I'll start with you.
Well, you know, at one level, you would expect that this would give additional traction on the Republican side to the candidates who have some foreign policy chops, some experience. But the fact is, the candidate who's exploited it the best, who's done the best, is the one who has consistently done that since the beginning of this race, despite all of the predictions of the pundits, and that's Donald Trump. Trump has taken the shrillest stand. Trump has suggested that the way to handle this, the way he would handle this, is to bomb the expletive out of ISIS, and he's used the shrillest rhetoric when it comes to the refugees. But most of the other candidates have moved in that direction as well. And one of the more interesting things that's happened is that the phrase that had been radioactive for so long, boots on the ground, having more American troops involved, now we're seeing some Republican candidates, including Jeb Bush, suggest that the only way we could do this is with a significant number of American troops. And there's some public opinion to suggest that Paris changed Americans to being a little more receptive to that.
All right, let's focus in on this more specifically, Steve. Let's separate out first the foreign policy focus, what we do about terrorism, Islamic extremism abroad, and then we'll get to the question of refugees and letting Syrians and Iraqis and others into our country here. The boots on the ground issue, or what we do with our allies or ourselves, how has that debate evolved?
Well, it hasn't really evolved. It's been knocked out of the park, essentially, by President Obama saying that ISIS had been contained. And then shortly after that, we see a Russian airliner bombed out of Egypt. We see a bombing incident in a Hezbollah stronghold, also allegedly tied to ISIS. And of course, we see the Paris attacks. So all three of these expand the ISIS battlefield dramatically, and they make President Obama and his administration and approach look very impotent and completely sort of out of touch with the realities of what's unfolding. And so when it comes to alliances, a couple of things are happening. One, Russia is big in the game, and just as Norm said, the other element of a weird angle of this politically is that Donald Trump is also the person applauding Russian military engagement and involvement in the region, something that very few other Republicans are doing. But he's demonstrating a kind of dexterity with some of this. When it comes to our relations with the Europeans, I think they're strong. We're all standing. We're all French now. We're all Parisians now. Everyone's standing forward. But nonetheless, the environment in which this activity took place in Paris happened under very tight, strict, careful intelligence watching, intelligence gathering, and nonetheless, when you look at the sophistication and the footprint of what these terrorists were able to do, it raises a lot of questions about the quality and content of that international collaboration. Now, we're seeing France invoking never invoked clauses of the European Union declaration and possibly going eventually to NATO to say that attack on them is attack on everyone and everyone must be part of that. So there's a lot of tension and pressure on the White House to figure out how it's going to respond. It's responded with a deployment of 50 special operations troops, which in the light of this new incident looks small and paltry. And that then raises the question of what President Obama's, he looks like he's dithering and unable to come forward with something. And just as Norm said, everyone is moving to the right, either calling for a Fortress America, where you cut everyone off and don't allow anyone in, or going with a much more robust military engagement and presence in the region.
I mean, some of on the Republican side, the ones who, the candidates who accentuated stay away, the Rand Paul, more isolationist, they could not have been happy to open up the newspapers, turn on the TV, and see international terrorism back as the top agenda. This blows some of their arguments out of the water, I would imagine.
This has been a bad week for Rand Paul, but he hasn't had a good week since the campaign began. He's been a non-factor. He had a very good debate the last time, but it won't help all that much. The candidate who may be hurt by this is Ben Carson, because Ben Carson, who's still got a substantial amount of support, the African-American candidate with a great life story, a neurosurgeon and all of that, but has demonstrated in the last week an appalling lack of knowledge about even the most basic things involving America and the world. And that may hurt him. Donald Trump is not much better, but Trump hasn't had some of the gaps in terms of knowledge that Carson has. And what makes a difference here is Carson is very soft-spoken. Trump is very belligerent. Right now, after Paris, belligerent wins.
Let's talk for a minute about an issue that has really blown up over the time since the Paris attacks, and that's the question of refugees and the welcome or the non-welcome of Syrian and Iraqi refugees into the United States. This has become a huge, hot political button. Why?
Well, it's happened because one of the terrorists, the alleged terrorists in France, apparently made his way into Europe through Greece, along with a lot of other refugees. And that has raised the crisis that if that happened, then you can't trust any Syrians in the minds of some. And basically, this is the politics of fear. This is what in the previous administration before Obama, Dick Cheney talked about, that there are certain people, we're at war with Islam, they say, they're at war with Muslims, they say, they're at war with extremists that come out of that, and it's very hard to be able to differentiate between good people and bad people, so don't let any of them in. But you have to understand the backdrop. Millions of people are displaced in Syria, and Europe is absorbing this, and it's creating a real tension inside Europe, which is being reflected in the United States, that those outsiders, those refugees, are dangerous to our way of life, and that can create the kind of terrorism and terrorist impulses that we've seen play out in Paris. The interesting thing about this is that until this happened, there was a groundswell of support saying that America needed to do more, that it needed to demonstrate a kind of Christian magnanimity and bring people in and help people who were running away from the very kind of terror that we've seen play out in Paris. And Barack Obama himself, I know from a close White House source, was deeply involved in what seemed like the minimal issue of just getting our refugee numbers up from Syria up to 10,000. That small blip, which is so controversial now, is just a small drop in the bucket for the problems that are out there. But the president is deeply vested in this. The Republicans know that, and even those in his own party aren't comfortable telling. Many in their own party aren't basically willing to embrace, a much more open and inclusive process for Syrians, who are running for their lives out of that country. So it's an incredibly uncharitable moment that we're at.
I mean, it's especially Republicans, but it also extends bipartisan in this sense.
Yeah, there are a couple of things to keep in mind here. The first is most of the terrorists in France apparently were European citizens. And the fear in the United States, realistic one, is not so much about refugees coming in. It's really about homegrown terrorism, which becomes a lot easier in this country because guns are everywhere. The National Rifle Association, of all things, has been trying to block a bill that would keep people with potential terrorist backgrounds from getting guns. The second is that Republicans have exploited the immigration issue. That's been the #1 issue. That's what vaulted Donald Trump into a lead in the first place. This is an extension in a lot of ways of the immigration issue, but taken to another level because of a fear about terrorist attacks. In the House of Representatives, without any debate or deliberation, they slapped together a bill that would effectively block any refugees from coming in. It was a bizarre bill because it basically would require the Director of National Intelligence, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and the head of the FBI all personally to certify each refugee coming in as being 100% clean and incapable of doing terrorism, which of course would just take them all away from the jobs that they have protecting the homeland. And it passed the House with a pretty close to a veto-proof margin. 47 Democrats supported it. Nobody wants to be out there looking soft on terrorism at this point. Now it's a question of whether it makes it through the Senate, either surviving a filibuster or a veto-proof majority there. But what's happened is we're feeding the flames of insecurity over an attack like this. Everybody looks at Paris. They don't look at it in the same way as they would a Beirut or a Baghdad. You think of, or we think of ourselves sitting in a theater, eating a meal in a cafe. Somebody pulls up in a car with a machine gun and blasts you, and it's too close to home. And right now, it's playing to the worst instincts of the country.
Well, I mean, for France, Paris is very much like 9/11, and our close relationship with them is driving this politics of fear here, just as Norm said. But and while I doubt that it will get through the Senate, nonetheless, this is going to continue to reverberate in the American election cycle now. This is a moment when foreign policy and national security will really matter, and it's impacting not just the Republicans, in which you do have a belligerent Donald Trump with answers, telling people what they want to hear, reinforcing their fears, and giving them the sense if we only keep everyone out, we'll be a safer nation. That resonates. We need to understand that resonates with a lot of American citizens, but so too in the Democratic Party.
We're going to come back after the break to talk about how this impacts the Democratic race, and also to look forward a bit to see whether or not this might have lingering impact throughout the entire country in the congressional races in November 2016. In just a moment. Again, our panel of political experts includes Steve Clemons. Steve is the Washington editor-at-large for The Atlantic and editor of Atlantic Live, as well as a senior fellow and founder of the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation, a prominent think tank here in Washington, where he previously served as executive vice president. Steve writes and speaks frequently about the D.C. political scene, foreign policy, and national security issues, as well as domestic and global economic policy challenges. Sitting next to him is Norman Ornstein. Norm is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, an election analyst for CBS News, and a contributor to the National Journal and Atlantic magazines. His newest book is It's Even Worse Than It Looks: How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism. So let's pick up where we just left off. We've focused on the impact of Paris on the Republicans. Well, who benefits and how does it impact on the Democratic nomination contest, Steve?
Well, the big winner is Hillary Clinton, and not unsurprising. But one of the concerns that many in the Democratic base had about Hillary Clinton is that she was too hawkish, that she was too ready to jump into the fray, to intervene, to offer no-fly zones, and all of the derivative requirements militarily that would require in a lot of what looked to many people like insoluble conflicts. And that was looked at as a real weakness of Hillary Clinton. In this climate, it's an overwhelming strength. And when you compare that to the other potential candidates, Martin O'Malley and Bernie Sanders, they fall off in comparison. So Hillary Clinton already has come out essentially with an implicit critique of her former boss, Barack Obama, saying ISIS is not contained, that we need a much more robust no-fly zone in Syria, that we need to be more deeply engaged militarily. A lot of it is just incremental steps, just very close in reaffirming much of what the administration has done, but she's doing it in a tougher, with tougher rhetoric and with more passion.
I want to focus on President Obama for a moment. As you mentioned earlier, he had perhaps one of the most poorly timed press conferences, yes, just the night before the Paris attacks.
Why they don't like press conferences.
in which he said that ISIS was contained. He's been behind the 8 ball on ISIS almost from the very beginning. ISIS was the American colloquialism, the JV, the junior varsity, not the top rank of terrorists a year ago. Is there a point at which in collective American political psyche, he becomes viewed as just not up to par, not in the right league in addressing what is commonly now viewed as a very serious terrorist challenge to our allies and to ourselves?
It could happen, but let's be fair for a minute. Until
no, let's not be fair.
No, I just want to be very clear that I'm one of these people that does watch terrorism a lot, and I heard lots of pundits. I myself have thought we were systematically underestimating ISIS, and those that looked at what was happening with the Russian airliner, that have looked at ISIS's activities, and plus just looked at the numbers, going back to the stupid games we used to play with Vietnam, where there was a number count of the number dead. But if you look at the number of people we have killed in the pursuit against ISIS, it's somewhere around 14,000, 15,000 people. It begins to beg the question of how big ISIS is, how does it do what it is. We just hit recently a convoy with 8 major ISIS leaders, and what we can sort of put as notches in the belt of things that we have accomplished demonstrate a profound resilience of ISIS, an unbelievable ability to kind of take the harshest set of attacks. So I've been the one who thinking that we were underestimating ISIS all along. But most of the terror watching profession didn't think ISIS did Paris. Most of them thought it was Al-Qaeda. Most of them thought it was, because they didn't think ISIS was sophisticated enough to bring that level of footprint of terror to a city like Paris. So everyone has been wrong, including President Obama, in my view. But in the process of this, it doesn't change the basic reality that Syria, as messy it is, remains a civil war with a proxy war stacked on top of it. And that that a president of the United States would be wise to be cautious of devoting resources too deeply into that, because it is by definition already a quagmire before you've begun. So we just need to be clear that he may have misdiagnosed what ISIS was, but even if you did know what ISIS was and you saw the Arab street not participating in taking down ISIS, you saw a muscular reaction from Saudis and the Gulf nations to attack Yemen, almost nothing from them in dealing with ISIS. So it's a very nasty knot, and I just want to, just put a point in there saying that President Obama hasn't been completely wrong in response.
There are a couple of things I would add to that. One is you could have a different thesis here. ISIS had focused entirely on building its caliphate, had not, as Al-Qaeda had done, gone out and done attacks in other parts of the world. This was unprecedented in many ways and unusual, and it may well reflect a weakness on the ground in Syria, a desire to show that they've got a larger footprint when in fact they are, as Obama had suggested, being moved out of cities and having less military success in Syria. That may not matter very much. The fear of an attack is great. And the fact is, all it takes is one or two people in a homegrown way to go out there with machine guns to make a real difference. At the same time, if there is an attack in the United States, even if it is a lone wolf kind of attack, that is going to be a real problem for Obama and for Obama's legacy. Right now, though, what matters is whether he can somehow make a pivot, and whether it is by working out a deal with Russia and the Europeans, by basically putting a whole lot more sophisticated weaponry in the hands of the Kurds, which will drive Mr. Erdogan up a wall. Right. But now I think the Europeans don't much care about that. Whether we put more of a squeeze on the Saudis, which we have not done up till now, those are the things that will matter in terms of the long-term legacy of how he's dealt with this set of problems.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop here. Regrettably, we're out of time. But we're going to be also regrettably coming back to this issue in the months ahead, yes, and its impact also more broadly on our national election in 2016. Thank you very much for joining us, Steve and Norm.
Thank you.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول السياسة الأميركية حيال اللاجئين والإرهاب، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.